Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Our American friend TJ is back after a bit of a break, and she's here to ask us some questions. So go ahead, TJ.
Hi, Dale. Yes, indeed. With the back to school vibe in the air, or well, not depending on some places, I am curious about the implications of the prorogation decision. So you did the explainer, and now I am very curious about how it's going to affect the strategy of the various parties involved, especially given it's a minority government, and especially given the need as perceived by the general world order for some stability in global governance at the moment, and how that could potentially affect the moves of the various minority parties.
Okay. All right. So the thing is that with the throne speech is going to come with a confidence vote sooner than later. And that's something Trudeau is somewhat counting on, actually. And it was one of the things when he said, when he's proroguing, it's not to avoid a confidence vote, it's to actually kind of force one. So to a certain extent, there's a bit of a game of chicken being played right now. Trudeau is going to lay out a very ambitious plan for economic recovery, which is going to be a lot of stuff about green growth, a lot of stuff about inclusive growth. And he's basically going to be daring the opposition parties to vote against it because one of the things is that one of the truisms of Canadian politics is that nobody wants to go to an election.
Interesting.
We never want to go to an election. There's always whenever people try and make a tactical calculation to call an early election, there have been quite notable cases where governments have been punished for going too early.
And what are the implications of how is the government punished for going too early?
They get defeated.
The result?
Yeah. There's been some spectacular defeats. They were riding high in the polls and decided to go early. And the voting public saw that as being far too cynical and voted them out. So that's always a calculation that can happen.
And then now we have some apparent solidity being pushed upon our elections south of the border, which don't have this flexibility built in. So
No.
This is a very interesting contrast to what is going on in the American electoral system with our dramas over mail-in voting, etc.
Yeah.
But this is a whole different angle.
Yeah, so this is one of the things is, a lot of the talk right now amongst the pundit class is looking at the polls. The Liberals are still up. There's there's people who think that because they're riding higher, they can go to an election while the pandemic is still okay. We're not in our second wave yet, but that could be well into it by the time the election rolls around.
That definitely sounds like a risk, is gaming the timing of the second wave of COVID.
Yeah, and get a majority that way, but I don't know that that's necessarily a sound calculation. So that's kind of the overview anyway. He's basically gonna force the opposition parties into some kind of way of looking like they're standing up to him, but at the same time letting the government carry on because really nobody wants an election. The Conservatives have a brand new leader who hasn't had enough time to establish himself or really get, solidify the party under himself. The NDP are still broke after the last election, and the Bloc, the Bloc is the Bloc.
The Bloc is the Bloc.
They've got their own particular calculations that I'm not necessarily privy to, but nobody necessarily really wants to have an election right now, even though they may be doing a bunch of chest thumping.
So that's interesting. So this thing of essentially there's a version of face-saving, which is not inherently a bad thing. I mean, it's politics, right?
Yeah.
There's an element of image that's fundamental to it.
Yeah.
So you have to walk this line as the minority leadership party to kind of provide, like you were saying, provide opportunities for the other parties to establish themselves as their independence and their own approach.
Yeah, for sure. And so the way they're going to end up doing that is probably finding... Well, the Conservatives are pretty much certain to vote against it because that's their job as the official opposition. The government really doesn't have to go out of their way to get their support for things. The worst that might happen is a number of people may wind up missing a vote for mysterious reasons that will get them just under the threshold for the government to stay in. That's certainly happened before. We've also seen in previous hung parliaments where the opposition has simply abstained on a vote, on a confidence vote, because they didn't want to go to an election at that point either. The NDP are likely to try and get some kind of deal out of the government in terms of their own priorities. A lot of the priorities...
Like an obvious thing? Or would it be more of a sort of corridors of diplomacy kind of agreement?
Little of both. We've noticed in the last few months the NDP have claimed victory on a number of things where it really wasn't them at all, like certain support payments and so on that the government was already doing, and the NDP take credit for it. Insisting that they pushed the government into it, even though they were pushing on an open door. So that's one of the things we're likely to see. They will likely bundle a bunch of stuff together and say, we can live with this, or they'll talk tough and demand one more thing, and then the government, will likely say, oh, I guess I'll give you that. That's what's more likely to happen than anything, especially given that, like I said, they've been basically taking credit for everything that's been going on anyway. So one more thing that they would, to take credit for is not, I don't think is that much of a loss.
So with the NDP, they're kind of I guess it's all relative, but they're in a power position, right, in this situation?
To an extent, yes. Because the Bloc right now are demanding that Trudeau and his chief of staff resign and that Chrystia Freeland take over. That's
quite an extreme position.
It's an extreme position, and
yes.
Possibly predicated on the hope that if Trudeau is no longer in charge, then that might make Quebec votes easier to obtain. Because they don't have a francophone leader, for example.
Right. Oh, that's interesting.
So that's likely what that calculation is. But again, it's a lot of chest thumping right now as well.
It's all very Game of Thrones speech. I just got inspired by you for that one. You're welcome, Dale.
I might use that one.
It's all yours. So then, historically, have the NDP been in this position before? They have an opportunity to make the most of something, and they need to be quite strategic.
They were most especially during the last Liberal hung parliament, which was under Paul Martin in the early 90s. The NDP struck a deal to get a bunch of things in a budget. Crowed about it, look at all the great things we did, and then voted the government down before they could actually implement any of those things. So it all wound up being for naught. And yet they still to this day pat themselves in the back for getting all those things in that budget which never got implemented.
So this is really fascinating to me because I feel like the implications of the decisions of, let's say, basically my understanding is that the Conservatives are going to do their automatic opposition vote, and they have a clear reason to avoid the election, right, with their new leader. The Bloc has its own agenda that it's sticking to.
Yeah.
So the implications of the NDP's moves here are actually going to be quite far-reaching for the continuing government support and government options for support for the inevitable, as it seems, second wave of COVID and beyond into 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of what the government is signaling would play to the NDP's base anyway. May not be everything they want, may not be as fast as they want, but a lot of it still plays to that regardless. Because there's essentially the Canadian centre has shifted far more to the left in the last decade than it has previously. And there's a really good piece that Paul Wells wrote in Maclean's about that a couple weeks ago. So I would encourage people to go and check that out. And I will try and remember to put a link to that in below when this gets posted. But because of that, a lot of the votes that the NDP and the Liberals are voting for are competing for are in the same space. And so the NDP are somewhat cognizant of this, but also trying to ensure that they're painting the Liberals as worst as possible in order to try and maintain that vote base that the Liberals have been eating into.
So I guess this is a great overview and has actually made me excited about the potential elements at play here in the election season, which is a hard thing to do for an American at this moment, to get excited about fall election season. The thing I would ask is, as I'm kind of keeping an eye on potential developments of this, is this a space where you think that the NDP will use social media more actively? Or do you, as a more sort of subtle way of pushing forward what they're trying to package as their achievements or their wins, as you put it? Or is this a case where everybody's going to be very careful about social media and stick to kind of party talking points?
I think it's a little of both. Everyone is largely adhering to party talking points for the most part anyway, barring a few rogues here and there. But I think you will see a lot of a much more concerted effort about taking credit for moves the Liberals are making and insisting that they were the ones who were really responsible and who pushed them into it.
Oh, I actually have a final question that you just prompted for me. Do you think that there'll be an emergence of any kind of attack dog in the poll positions for these kinds of the NDP Liberal sort of dialogue as we approach the throne speech, or is there more of a sort of a theme of unity, consensus, don't sort of make things contentious in this very contentious time for people in their individual lives?
That one, I think it's a little too hard to call right now.
Okay, so that's something that emerges closer to the actual...
Yeah, when we get a few more signals about what's in there.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to seeing how that develops. Thank you so much, Dale. As usual, I feel highly educated and even more curious after each of these conversations.
All right, and it's great to talk to you again.
All right.
And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.